Ed Wagner definitively has proven that the Chokbo is a useful historical document. Hello everyone, this is Mark Peterson again with the Frog Outside the Well Research Center, and today my guest is one of my best students. He's now working on a PhD at Oxford University. That's Oxford, Ohio, isn't it?
Oxford in the United Kingdom.
Oh, the real Oxford.
The real Oxford.
This is Derek Driggs, and he's a very, very bright student. His Korean language is just remarkable, and he's a PhD student in linguistics at Oxford. And I thought today it would be fun for Derek and I to talk about Ed Wagner and Chokbo. Now, Ed Wagner was my professor at Harvard. What do you know about Ed? Did I ever talk about him very much?
You've talked about him a little bit, and he's pretty well known in the Korean studies community because I guess he's sort of the father of Korean studies.
He really is. He's the first person to get a PhD in Korean history. He was an undergraduate at Harvard. He actually started at Harvard when he was 17 years old. And he got drafted in 1944 after his sophomore year. And was on a ship on his way to Japan when the war ended.
Oh, wow.
So he ends up getting rerouted from Japan into the occupational army of Korea.
Wow.
That was his exposure to Korea.
Okay.
And from there he returned back to Harvard, did his junior and senior year thinking, I need to learn about Korea. And that's where it started. And then he got a master's degree. His master's thesis was on the Korean community in Japan.
Oh, okay.
And since then there have been doctoral dissertations written on the Che-il Kyopo, but his was the first as a master's degree. And then for his PhD, he wrote a dissertation on the literati purges. In fact, it was published as a book here, The Literati Purges of Early Korean History, where
Yun Sang-gun,
Yun Sang-gun went on a blind rage, and purged in two separate purges. This covers three purges. Jungjong also had one after Yun Sang-gun. But he talks about these three literary purges, and he really completely rewrote Korean history about this period. The previous history was assumed it was a power grab between different power groups, and he argues that there was really an ethical aspect of it, of ethical Confucianism, people wanting to do the right thing and wanting the king to do the right thing, and the king lashed back at them. So his dissertation was really important. And then later on he translated a famous book of Korean history called Hanguksa Shillon, which was written by Baek, the most prominent scholar at Sogang University. And Ed Wagner went through and very, very carefully and precisely translated that book. In fact, it was maybe too precise and too careful, because it was a little bit too heavy for the American reader, who needs more of a introduction, not a detailed, college level. They've already had it in high school, now they get it in college. So he was involved with Carter Eckert, his to-be colleague at Harvard, in rewriting a new history of Korea, calling it Korea Old and New, which is the standard work in Korean history studies in America. And they brought in Yu Young-ik and Mike Robinson to help with the modern era, since Baek and Ed Wagner are both pre-modern people. The Hanguksa Shillon, the first one that they did, actually ends in 1960. So it doesn't cover a lot more ground period. So they brought in some modernists to help them to do that. And so Ed Wagner, after he did his master's degree, how do you start a new field? How do you become the first person? And he worked with the Harvard scholars in Japan, Edward Reischauer, the father of Japanese studies in America, and John King Fairbank, the father of Chinese studies in America. The two of them taught him, and then they sent him off to Japan for 2 years, and then off to Korea for 3 years, where he did his dissertation work. Then he came back to Harvard, and this is an illustration of the Harvard Yenching building. The building is dedicated to East Asian studies, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. And he had an office up here on the second floor. And in the basement of this building, you got these incredible holdings. You know, Harvard has the largest university library of any library in the world.
I have heard that.
Even more than Oxford?
Perhaps, yes.
Oxford must have a lot too, though. But the collection there includes a lot of very interesting documents called Chokbo. And in talking about Ed Wagner today, I want to talk about his contribution to Chokbo.
Right.
What have you heard about the use of Chokbo, and what do Korean scholars say about Chokbo?
Well, you know, Chokbo is really interesting because it's quite controversial, actually. I mean, people say that Chokbo can't be relied on because people bought their way into the family record, and there's a lot of sort of false information in there. So I don't know what you'd have to say about that, but I've definitely heard that a lot from Korean scholars and just normal Koreans alike. So.
That's right. And in earlier YouTube that I've put out, some people have commented that Chokbo are 99% unreliable.
Somebody said that. I've heard that a lot as well.
I'm sorry, folks, that's not true. Ed Wagner definitively has proven that the Chokbo is a useful historical document. And the proof runs in two important areas. Number one is that the idea of falsification comes about in the 20th century when people, slave background, commoner background, who didn't have surnames, made some money and wanted to buy their way into a Chokbo. No one has ever said that people were buying their way into Chokbo in the 19th century.
Okay.
So number one is that the Chokbo that you use historically, 19th and 18th and 17th century documents, can be used to validate the 20th century. And you can find out where the falsifications are and the exaggerations are. That's the first point. The second point is that, like any historical document, you just don't use it by itself. You have to verify it. You know, you don't look at just the Shilluk alone. The Shilluk, you know, the annals, the official annals, is mostly reliable, but you want to corroborate your evidence there as much as you can.
Right.
And in corroborating evidence with the Chokbo, Ed Wagner found all kinds of ways that it is much more accurate than inaccurate.
I see.
And he's revolutionized the study of Chokbo in Korea. There are some scholars now that will use Chokbo as a historical resource, but there's still that popular view out there that it's all falsified and it's you buy your way in. But it's really not that way.
Well, it's such an amazing resource that they have, and it seems like it's not being taken advantage of.
And that's what Ed Wagner tried to do. His post-dissertation work was not on Chokbo. A lot of people think he's the Chokbo man.
Right.
But what he was looking at was the examinations,
the
examination rosters, and people that passed exams.
Right.
And he was looking at how the people who passed exams were connected to each other through marriage connections and other connections. And you can find all of that in the Chokbo.
I see.
So it was really an important innovation that he brought to the world. So those are some of the things I'd like to say about Ed Wagner. This picture here brought back tremendous memories. What does that look like? We call this a carrel. A carrel in the library. The carrel is a strange word in English, but it means just a desk in the library. This is where I lived for about 5 years.
Okay.
All of us graduate students had a carrel in the library, surrounded by Chokbo and other historical books.
It looks a little too familiar to me as well. So.
That's where you are now.
Yes.
You have a carrel in the library?
I do, yep.
Oh, that's great. Well, I want to thank Derek for coming in today and helping us to re-examine the wonderful contributions that Ed Wagner has made to Korean studies. He's really the father of Korean studies.
Thank goodness for him. It sounds like he sort of is the reason why we're even able to do this.
And he was a wonderful teacher. On a personal note, he was so approachable. We always said his door is always open, and we were careful not to use his time too much. But when we went to talk to him about something, it was very often an hour or two. Because he'd get engaged and show us what he was working on, and ask us more about what we're working on. So a wonderful professor and a great senior scholar in the Korean studies field.
Wonderful.
So he was sort of like my father. He's like your grandfather. To use those
I'm honored.
Korean terms. So thanks, Derek, and thank you all for watching. See you next time.